such an immeasurable cultural impact in its prime that it is still felt today. In fact, this phenomenon was so big that it is often used as one of the main defining characteristics of an entire generation. First, let's go back in time, all the way to the 1980s. Get comfortable, we'll be here for a while. So, the 1980s, also known as the decade of decadence. The decade of decadence. I'll get back to that later. Obviously, I'm no expert, but from what I could scrap together, the rapid expansion of cable TV, the launching of 27 news networks, and the introduction of widely broadcasted music videos by the innovative cultural powerhouse MTV meant that this was a time of very high media saturation. This was also around about the time the internet was invented. That's right, the internet. Unfortunately, many people who were our age didn't feel that they or their concerns were accurately represented in the mass media. They viewed the image-driven, superficial world of mainstream culture and music as excessive, which commonly resulted in feelings of alienation and apathy in the youth. Let's take a look at a quote from 1992 by music critic Simon Reynolds about Generation X, which is the generation of our parents. There is a feeling of burnout in the culture at large. Kids are depressed about the future. In my opinion, this summarizes the situation well. We have Gen X, much of which is dealing with heavy changes and feeling lied to by ever-growing commercialism and consumerism. Now, don't you think that a situation like this provokes a reaction? Well, what I'm talking about today is grunge. More specifically, the death of grunge. I'm going to assume that a lot of you don't know what grunge is, which is fine, because we're going to find out now. And to do that, we have to witness its birth. Seattle, Washington, in the middle of the 1980s. The decade of decadence. Decadence being the moral or cultural decline in the form of excessive indulgence in pleasure and luxury. Before I ask you if such a situation doesn't provoke a reaction, in this case it did, and it wasn't modest. The result was one of the most significant cultural rebellions of modern times. But it didn't happen all that fast. Emerging from Seattle's underground music scene towards the end of the 80s, grunge was a subgenre of alternative rock, fusing elements of punk rock and heavy metal, also known as the Seattle sound. Slowly it spread to surrounding cities of the Pacific Northwest, which was suffering from an economic recession at the time. With its depressed sound and indifferent lyrics, it seemed to encapsulate the atmosphere of the region. Now, it's not entirely true to call grunge a rebellion. While punk was confrontational, anarchistic, defiant, and sought to provoke and disrupt, grunge was less an active opposition and more a rejection. societal pressures to conform, achieve, and aspire. It was like saying, I don't want anything to do with you. This is my own thing. And for this reason, grunge was so rooted in detachment and disinterest. Grunge's breakthrough into mainstream culture is a subject of debate. The most widely accepted theory is that it was the release of Nirvana's second album, Nevermind, in September 1991 that put grunge into the spotlight. Their first album, Bleach, sold 40,000 copies, a respectable number for an underground release. Looking at Nevermind, the band had low expectations. The goal was to sell a total of 250,000 copies. Yet a couple months after release, it was selling 300,000 copies every week. It was on top of all the charts, as was its lead single, Smells Like Teen Spirit. Nevermind was a huge success, becoming one of the best-selling albums of all time with over 30 million copies to this date. And Nirvana's founder and frontman, Kurt Cobain, who was also their lead vocalist, guitarist and songwriter, became known as the voice of his generation. So what was so special about grunge that made it so popular? Well, it gave Gen X something to identify with. Grunge was characterized by angsty, often dark lyrics, and combined with its independent DIY ethos, emphasized by heavily distorted guitar riffs, it conveyed raw emotion in a time lacking precisely that genuine authenticity and honesty. But it didn't stop there. Grunge transcended the plane of music, sparking another revolution in fashion. A thrift store look, often consisting of ripped jeans and the iconic flannel shirt, became the visual symbol of the grunge movement. Other large-scale successes include Pearl Jam's 10, Alice in Chains' Dirt, Stone Temple Pilots' Core, and Soundgarden's Super Unknown. Grunge was thriving. It dominated the music scene of the early 90s. MTV was playing Smells Like Teen Spirit over 20 times a day, and Kurt Cobain was one of the most popular Halloween costumes for years. Unfortunately, grunge didn't last forever. With its absorption into mainstream culture and high commercialization, it was effectively contradicting its intended message. Moreover, the artists were uninterested in and significantly unprepared for the massive popularity and coverage they received. As often happens with the biggest stars of the world, many of them developed drug problems, possibly fueled in part by their strong emotions and pain they were going through. In April 1994, Kurt Cobain's suicide shocked the world. The face of grunge, the voice of a generation, had died. In fact, a large portion of your parents can probably still recall the moment they heard the news. People were devastated, and it only got worse. A not so fun fact is that of the biggest 5 grunge bands, only one of the 5 bands and one of the 5 vocalists is still alive today. The others were all lost to either suicide or drug overdose. The band is Pearl Jam, and the vocalist is Eddie Vedder. Their latest album came out last year. But didn't I say grunge was dead? That's right, I did, and to most people it is. This is because, as I said before, grunge was more than just music. It was the essence of a generation's struggles to adapt to a confusing world, forging its identity in the process. You might be thinking, well, we're Generation 2, right? And the world is, in terms of commercialization and media, arguably even more confusing than it was back in the 80s and 90s. So where is our cultural revolution? Well, you can't expect change to happen just like that. You have to want it really badly. Do we deserve change? I think every single one of us absolutely deserves complete authenticity and truth as we live our lives. But the question is, do we want it enough? Do we want it enough to be willing to jump out of line and seize it?